Oh, hello everybody. As you can see, I've come down to the sea today for the last in this series of occasional nature rambles during the lockdown. I've been asked to look at birds of prey this time. Hawks, falcons, eagles, owls, raptors. Are they all the same? What do all these names mean? Well, they can be confusing, but basically they're all the same. These are the birds with sharp talons and hooked beaks for catching and tearing up their prey. But it really doesn't matter what the scientists say. We're just interested in noticing that they're there at all and perhaps being able to tell one from the other. Well, probably most of us are familiar with this bird, the kestrel or windhover as it's sometimes called. This is a falcon, and actually it's not really hovering so much as flying into the wind, but that's not really important. What's more interesting is that it's using its remarkable eyesight to spot small voles, mice and occasionally insects in the long grass. In recent years, of course, it's become much more common along motorways and roads with wide grassy verges where prey is easy to find. If you look carefully, preferably not while driving, you may notice some birds have a grey tail with a black band at the tip, a grey head and a spotted on the back. This is the male. The female is brown with black stripes and a brown back and brown tail. Very different to the kestrel is the sparrow hawk. This is a hawk with short rounded wings and is a real smash and grab merchant, careering through the woods and hedgerows hoping to catch an unwary bird off guard. But you can also see them in the open air, soaring on the thermals on outstretched wings, probably looking for suitable wooded habitat in which to hunt. The male has a bluish back and with russet barred underparts, whereas the female is larger and browner with a grey barred chest and underparts. It's such an exciting bird to see. When I was walking recently in our local hills, I was startled by a flash of feathers and a whoosh of air as a sparrowhawk exploded out of a nearby bush and disappeared into the wood. A few seconds later, a rather bemused hen blackbird stumbled out of the bush and flew to some nearby cover. It may have been that the sparrowhawk had literally tried to bite off more than it could chew, because it was a small male, and a full-grown blackbird was perhaps a bit too much to take. Back to the falcons now, and to one of the most dramatic of all birds, the peregrine. Peregrines are not only one of the fastest birds in level flight, up to 60 miles an hour, but when they're diving onto prey, they can reach speeds of up to 200 miles an hour. That's about 370 kilometres an hour for those of you in metric, making them the fastest animal on the planet. Well, the male peregrine is about the same size as a sparrowhawk, but the female is considerably larger. Both have a slaty blue back and a pale barred underparts and a distinctive dark moustache contrasting with a white throat and cheek. Well, they often frequent cliffs and crags and can be quite easily seen along the coasts of Britain where there are sea cliffs which provide both nesting ledges and regular food in the form of gulls, pigeons and other small birds. But they've also recently become rather fond of nesting inland where cathedrals, clock towers and other tall structures often hosts young peregrine families in summer. Several of these have webcams, so you can follow them if you go online. Have a look at Bournemouth Clock Tower, Salisbury, Chichester and Derby cathedrals, which have all got wonderful webcams. Well, all these raptors have had a hard time in the recent decades because they were severely affected both by persecution from gamekeepers, but particularly by pesticides in the 1960s and 70s. Had it not been for painstaking work by scientists to identify that the chemicals were not only killing small birds, but because the raptors were eating the small birds, the pesticides were building up in their body and they were laying thin-shelled eggs, so they didn't breed very successfully. But peregrines also had another problem. As we've already seen, they're quite capable of taking a fully grown pigeon, and these are often plentiful around the cliffs. During the Second World War, there's a steady passage of carrier pigeons carrying messages to and from France and England. For the peregrines this was a gift, even though there was somewhat indigestible parts in the pigeon. But the situation was considered so bad that a special unit was set up under MI5 to patrol the coast and destroy as many peregrines as possible. Despite the success of this mission, actually the falcon numbers did recover after the war, but were soon affected by disturbance, persecution and, as we've already said, particularly pesticides. Well, weighing in at 3 or 4 times the size of any of these previous birds of prey is the buzzard. Although primarily a woodland bird, you're most likely to see them floating on thermals, lazily spiralling up and away in the sky. For such a large bird, I'm often amazed at how quickly they can disappear from sight. I saw 6 in the air at once recently, and when I looked again they'd all gone. It's the same when they're nesting. I can almost see a nest site from my study window, and yet they slip in and out in secret. Buzzards were badly affected by the decline in rabbits in the 1950s, when the disease myxomatosis was introduced to control rabbit numbers. Well, that it did, but it also removed the buzzard's main food source in a stroke. And for decades they were scarce in many parts of the country. But they've made a steady recovery in the last 20 years or so. Well, these raptors all managed to survive despite persecution, lack of food and the pesticides. But one species which really was driven to the edge of extinction was the red kite. Henry VIII actually declared this as a protected species because of its role in clearing up all the rubbish and detritus in the towns of Tudor England. But in the 18th and 19th century, red kites were ruthlessly pursued by gamekeepers because of the great popularity of game shooting. By the beginning of the 20th century, there were less than a handful of pairs left breeding in the remote parts of wild Wales. I remember in the 1990s taking my long-suffering young family to Wales and driving for hours until eventually we discovered a red kite high among the mountains. About this time, ornithologists were investigating how we could try and reintroduce and boost the population of red kites, which were in serious danger of extinction because the last few pairs were also being plundered by egg stealers and so forth. Young birds from Spain were eventually introduced to sites in England, particularly around Rockingham Forest and the Chilterns, and they've proved wildly successful. Well, birds of prey may well not sing like the songbirds, but they're certainly not silent. Here's the kestrel. The sparrow hawk also calls quite readily, but the youngsters are particularly noticeable and their call can travel for quite a distance through the woodland. Here's the peregrine piping high from up on a cliff. Well, one of the ones that I think is soonest heard, least forgotten, is the mewing of the buzzard, which can be heard far, far up in the sky. Red kites also call, but not quite so frequently as buzzards. Let's end with a look at some of the plants that you can find on the shingle. Yellowhorn poppy, sea cabbage and thrift or sea pink. Well, one of the most distinctive plants that you can see along the shingle by the seaside, in some places at least, is the yellowhorn poppy, or sea poppy, or bruise root as it sometimes used to be called. About this time in June it comes into flower and later will produce the horn-shaped pods that give it its name. But do beware, because although in the past the roots were used for curing bruises and so forth, the sap of the plant is poisonous, so don't touch it. Another very distinctive plant is sea cabbage, and you can see that here with these lovely white flowers. And alongside it is thrift, or sea pink as some call it. All these plants are growing in one of the most fragile habitats of all, the shingle, home to plants, invertebrates, and also very importantly along the east and south coasts, colonies of little terns which nest right amongst the shingle. So it's very important, if you are walking along the shingle, try not to trample these plants and keep a very wary eye out for the eggs of little terns if you happen to be in that sort of area. Well, that's the last of these looks at nature. I do hope you've enjoyed them, and as the lockdown eases you'll be more aware of the wonderful sounds and sights of nature which are all around us. We've looked at a variety of plants and animals which you're most likely to see in your daily lives. Remember the birds whose songs were repeated phrases? The song thrush, the chiff-chaff. The plants which feed butterfly caterpillars like the violets and jack by the hedge. And those horse stingers, the dragonflies, which don't sting at all, of course, but all are a vital part of the life of our ponds and rivers. It's not just that these plants and animals are pleasant things for us to enjoy when we wish, of course. They share this space with us and they're vital to our survival. And as this virus hopefully recedes, we can perhaps think more carefully about the part we can all play in reducing the effects of rapid climate change and the loss of habitat which has become so urgent in the last few decades. Each one of us has the power to affect change and to ensure that both us and the wildlife which we've seen over the last few weeks can thrive together. Goodbye.